Oh, Sociology 322. It is April 22nd. This is the lecture for this week's readings on religion and violence. These are tough readings this week. One, in terms of the various ideas that are in them, but two, you could call this in some ways the dark side of religion. We've talked so much about religion this semester, theories about religion in people's lives, the organization of religion, religious legitimacy, rituals, beliefs, all sorts of stuff. And this week we kind of are thrown really into these relationship between religion and elements of society, particularly in these reading elements of politics and battles and things like that, where religion is interwoven. And part of our job is to disentangle what does it mean to say that religion is part of all of these processes. I don't want to end the course this way, which is the reason why next week, if this week is kind of the dark side of religion, well then next week is the positive side of religion, if you will. So if this week is a way that religion can lead towards acts that we would usually judge as inhumane, cruel, or unjust, and the way religion is morphed kind of by social circumstances, something we talked about last week, then the next week's readings, in contrast to that, are the way that religion can actually kind of spur society, engage with injustices in society as a way of trying to ameliorate those injustices and kind of bring wisdom, maybe streams of wisdom or visions or motivations or even actions that can actually have a beneficial effect for society, much in contrast to this week's readings. So before we go any further though, a couple of quick announcements. Make sure you look at the syllabus update. It makes the next 2 weeks look a little different. Basically, I'm taking off a difficult reading, and then I'm adding a reading which isn't on D2L yet, on religion, social movements, and immigration, which will be our final reading. That'll be Thursday, April 40th. And then you'll notice that both days next week have online discussions, since I got rid of the reading on the last week of the class. But those online discussions are both open for a week, so don't feel like you have to kind of rush to get them done. You can actually use them as a way of studying. Speaking of studying, the final thing then is that the exam's coming up, and as I noted in the things I wrote on D2L, I'm actually on dissertation travel trips that exam week, so I'm unavailable for questions. However, I've given you the exam guide early so you can take a look, see if you have some questions, and then next week Friday, I can post a lecture that kind of wraps and bring everything together. On one personal note, I'll just mention that next week is a fun way to end for me because we're actually into the material that I study, which is basically religion and social movements, particularly along the US-Mexico border, which, in case you haven't figured out, is where Tucson is. And then I guess the only final thing to mention for the class is I'll be sending you an email in a week when the student evaluations become available online. I'm going to highly, highly, highly encourage you to fill out those evaluations. I take evaluations very seriously, particularly because this is a class where I don't have nearly as much kind of personal interaction with you as students as we would in a normal classroom. But the other reasons I take it seriously is I try to make the class better as I teach it in the future. I'm very open to throwing out readings, just all sorts of comments on how to do the class better. And then for me professionally, it's actually one of the key ways I get feedback. That's one of the great surprises of graduate school, which is what I'm completing, is a lot of times you don't get feedback on a lot of things. And you all have been paying more attention maybe than you wanted to me for the last couple of months. And so actually to get some of your feedback now, particularly on organizing the class, the content, the teaching, that sort of stuff, that'd be very helpful. So without saying too much more, let's jump into this week's reading about religion and violence. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of overview some approaches to violence, and then I'm going to play this week's two readings off of each other. I'm going to argue that the first reading, the one from Mark Juergensmeyer, is really about politics being used by religious groups, by religious persons, for religious reasons. And then the reading that we have for Thursday, which is about child suicide bombers is the wrong phrase, but basically child sacrificed soldiers in the Iran-Iraq war, is more of kind of a flip side of politics using religion for political ends. So try and pick up those distinctions as I talk. But let me just say kind of a couple of broad things first about violence. I'm going to kind of write a couple of words up here. So these are basically theoretical ways that we can think about violence. One of the main ways that violence has been thought about in the sociological tradition is through conflict theory. The great conflict theorists, of course, are Karl Marx being kind of the head conflict theorist. But basically the stream of conflict theory is that it looks at violence as part of conflict, as evidence of conflict, and also as a driving engine of conflict. But it usually looks to kind of interest, what we might call kind of concrete interests that are involved in a conflict that might be wrestled over. So this could be like political territory, it could be power in a political system, it could be over the means of production in a Marxist sense. It's any sort of kind of, I guess, concrete material interest that groups may actually become violent over. And a good example of this is within conflict theory. This strand, which is especially dominant coming up through the 1970s, and was one of the ways that conflict was thought about in terms of religious groups, basically saw religion as kind of this expressive element that kind of rode along with a utilitarian element. So the utilitarian element were these interests, these hard things that groups were struggling over, and the religious element was just seen as kind of this expressing of that conflict. But what the sociologists were really interested in was kind of the political struggle over any sorts of resources that were occurring. They were interested in the conflict. An example of what this tradition gave us, this conflict theory tradition that saw conflicts based in politics. Remember this again, based in politics with religion kind of riding along. An example of this would be to look at fascist Italy during Mussolini's days, when it was clear that there was a kind of a political agenda, a political purpose, and the Catholic Church and Catholicism was kind of used by Mussolini's fascist ideologues as a way to kind of continue or just kind of push political goals. Another example of this kind of conflict theory tradition is we could think about the IRA, the Irish Republican Army in Ireland, and that would be an example. If you studied this group, you could say, well, this is a non-dominant group, and what they're struggling for over is kind of land and political power and political legitimacy. And religion, again, Catholicism in this example, was kind of a way to kind of build solidarity and mark lines between combatants that were engaged in that conflict. And both of these examples, again, it's not religion that's necessarily central, but religion kind of rides along with it. Things have changed a bit, and so what I'll say is that the conflict theory in and of itself isn't what's most useful for thinking about religion, conflict, and violence nowadays. Instead, we have a couple of approaches that are very similar, and I kind of combine together here in my comments. And one of these is what we call a symbolic boundary approach. This approach basically looks at the parties of conflict. So whether the conflict's between a religious group and outsiders, or whether it's between insiders of a single religious group, it looks at the way that symbols actually are wrestled over as ways to try and gain legitimacy in kind of the public opinion and in the minds of people who are either part of the conflict or who are audiences watching the conflict. And then symbolic boundaries then are defined by these symbols. They tell you who's a part of which group. They wrestle over interpretations of symbols. And so in kind of a Durkheimian way, we see that the power struggle is as much as about kind of symbolic battles as it is about kind of hard material battles. So this symbolic boundaries approach tries to bring the two together, and oftentimes can find more about the conflict by looking at the symbols than by just looking at the hard stuff.